Hello and welcome to the Bloodstream Podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media, and made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I am your patient advocate and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your healthcare advocate, nonprofit nerd, and your other host, Amy Board, reminding you to please speak with a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
On today's show, the UK blood inquiry continues on, but reaching an end point. Clive Smith and Laurence Woollard join us to give us the latest from the UK blood inquiry. And on the other side of a treatment journey, the latest.
We just said, I can't believe these 2 bullet points.
Literally, it's the UK blood inquiry,
Yes.
and then the next one is about the first person to have received a commercially available hemophilia B gene therapy product in the United States. His name is Mason Buxton. He's our guest today on the latest gene therapy segment. Those are the 2 bullets. The blood inquiry from 40 years ago, and gene therapy is available now. We got all that and more on today's show. Welcome to Bloodstream.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for joining us today. And if you like what you hear, please share this episode on social media and subscribe to Bloodstream wherever you listen to your podcasts.
I also want to remind you, dear listeners, that the Bloodstream Podcast is indeed made possible by our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Yes, that's right, Takeda. Takeda's got this website, bleedingdisorders.com, where you can learn all about Takeda's resources for and commitment to the bleeding disorders community. Amy Board, Takeda believes in a world free of bleeds. And they are dedicated more than ever in their efforts to offer a wide range of programs and support to help patients throughout their treatment journey, wherever on that journey they may be. You can learn more by simply visiting bleedingdisorders.com. One more time for the folks in the back. That's bleedingdisorders.com. And for their founding and ongoing support of the Bloodstream Podcast, I would just like to say thanks, Takeda.
Me too. Thank you, Takeda.
And thanks as well to segment sponsor CSL Behring for supporting the gene therapy segment.
Yes.
All right, Amy Board.
Okay, Patrick, I can't wait to hear just your very wise...
I don't know about that. Don't frame it that way. No wisdom to be expected.
We've got one little bullet before we get to Clive and Laurence.
Yeah, so just a few hours ago, the International Society on Thrombosis and Hemostasis, also known as ISTH, released a statement regarding the upcoming publication of their hemophilia treatment guidelines. These are you've heard us speak about this here before. In short, there is a lot of concern with some of what these guidelines state. As this 15-plus paragraph defensive, if I may, email highlights, this is still technically in draft. These are not published, and so some of the discussion that took place, such as at WFH, around these draft guidelines was critiqued and criticized in this email. Next month, the ISTH has an annual meeting that'll be in Bangkok. I know of numerous people from our greater hemophilia bleeding disorders orbit who intend to be there, some of whom specifically intend to be there to discuss this with the right decision makers and folks there. There's kind of 2 things, Amy, that are on my mind. Well, so number one, I hope that there's something in the next 6 weeks at that conference that might help move the ball forward in a productive way. Number 2, if the guidelines are indeed published as substandard, that will have direct impact on patients around the world. If doctors and the payers around the world can point to guidelines.
And governments. Purchase clotting factor.
And they can say, these guidelines say X, therefore we're going to do X. And
Yeah.
if those are suboptimal, we have now validated people treating patients suboptimally all around the world. So it's a big problem. I am even more concerned, though, with something that their email states and things I've heard from our hemophilia folks about the nature of the relationship between ISTH, WFH, and other hemophilia organizations. There was one person who commented to me that they were afraid that what's happening now may cause irreparable harm between the ISTH and the greater hemophilia community. So there's a short-term issue to address, these guidelines. And then there's a long-term consideration that I think needs prioritization as well. If we're not working collaboratively, cohesively, globally together now and into the future, we're doomed.
Yeah.
So those are two updates as it relates to these upcoming guidelines, and hopefully maybe in the July episode on the heels of the June meeting, we'll have gotten some more insights. I'd be surprised if there's much more about this between now and the meeting in Bangkok, but I'm sure after that we'll hear some more.
And just to clarify, we've talked about the WHO guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines, released suboptimal guidelines, I think at the beginning of this year or something like that, and that this is different. It's like the same vibe, but it's different.
Right, yeah. So they're different than the WHO guidelines. Okay. So within a period of a few weeks there, we had two different international bodies that were coming out with problematic directions or draft versions of problematic directions. So I'm sure there will be more, but not for some weeks yet, and hopefully for the better.
Well, thanks for that update, and we'll keep watching.
We'll stay tuned, and we'll let you know once there is more. So Amy Board, tell us a little bit more about Mason Buxton and the gene therapy segment on today's episode.
Well, we had Mason's dad, Jameson, on the segment last month.
We're working our way through the whole family.
I know, we're going to get the whole family. And Jameson is so unique because not only is he a parent of Mason, who has hemophilia B, he is the HTC director. He's the Hemophilia Treatment Center director there in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And Mason made the decision after his shared decision-making process with his physicians that he would like to move forward and to have the first commercially available gene therapy product. And so this is kind of his story about how he made that decision, what were some of his pros and cons, why he was so drawn to it, and also a little bit about how it was covered through our payer system, which I think is it's just kind of like a vortex of like, how is that going to work?
Yeah, that's important to hear about.
I should mention that Melody Joy Payne is one of our producers, and she very lovingly put this segment together and did the interview with Jameson and Mason. So we really want to thank her. And this segment is fantastic, and it's brought to you by CSL Behring, a global biotherapeutics leader focused on serving the rare disease community by providing innovative therapies. They now have a first-of-its-kind treatment for hemophilia B. To learn more about this treatment option, visit beyondhemb.com and download the B Support app from the App Store or Google Play to stay up to date on relevant information and to manage your treatment journey.
Sounds like your dad was a bit hesitant and obviously knew that you were an adult and couldn't make the decision for you, but he sounded like he was really nervous in the beginning. So what was that decision making like on your end?
Well, it wasn't really that hard to agree to it. I mean, I went in for an annual appointment at the hemo center, and they mentioned the gene therapy to me. And I think it was probably a couple weeks later where I called them back and I said I wanted to do it. I didn't know my dad was hesitant though. That's
really
kind of surprising.
I think. Yeah, it sounded like he was just like from a dad's perspective, like I don't really want my child to be a guinea pig per se.
Yeah, definitely.
Did you have any of that fear or hesitancy in the beginning, or was it mostly excitement?
I never thought that I would see this in my lifetime. The hemogenics, I never knew that was going to happen. So once I heard about it, it was very exciting. So I wanted to jump into it as fast as I could so I could get it done.
Yeah, I hear you have quite the fear of needles. Is that right?
Yeah, I do. I don't like needles. I never liked them. When I started infusing, I think I was about 7 when I started doing it myself. It was a little bit easier, but I was always very nervous about getting poked and sometimes almost passed out. Those are some great stories.
You'd think after all those pricks, you'd figure it out,
right?
But it's just you. Yeah.
No, it seemed like it was getting worse and worse. So yeah.
Was that one of the motivating factors for you behind doing the gene therapy?
That was a big one. I wanted to see what it would be like to live. I don't want to say live normal. I've always been normal, but have a life without bleeds. That was a very big thing. And also I have family members that have it too. So, we always talked about how we don't enjoy having it. I mean, it's always, it's always like that figure on your shoulder, that you got to always worry about. So yeah, it was the needles, but it was also I wanted to live without having a bleeding disorder. I mean, I'll always have it, but I don't have to infuse and I don't get bleeds. So
Your mom said there was a lot of buzz in the room that day. Like everybody was feeling how much this could potentially not just impact you, but others with it.
Definitely.
So how has it changed from like before to now? Like what things are different for you in your life?
In June, it'll be my 1 year, I guess you could say, anniversary since I had the gene therapy. And I haven't had to infuse.
That's huge.
I have not had any bleeds. And before, if I were to go, let's say 2 weeks without infusing, with very little activity, not doing anything, being a couch potato, basically, I would still end up getting a bleed. And I have not had a bleed. And it's been fascinating, honestly, that I've never had one. I always thought I was going to get one. I bump my elbow at work. I'll squish my toe, my finger, whatever, and nothing. Nothing.
Wow.
It's
Wow. So has it allowed you to be more active? Are there things that you're able to do that you held back from before?
Yes, I am more active now for sure. And I've also noticed a change in my mood. I feel more uplifted.
What sorts of things do you enjoy? Like, is there something that's like a hobby that you would pursue?
I probably wouldn't pursue it as a career, but I do love to go fishing. That's one of my biggest things that I do. I love to trout fish and be in the river. And that's something that I want to be able to do in the long term. I'd love to be able to go out fishing and still be able to cast and, not start, having that pain in my body. And that's kind of, I guess, another reason why I think it's a good idea that I got the gene therapy, is for that long-term, joint health. I hike a lot. I hike a lot with my dog, and then hunting. We've always been an outdoor family, and once I became an adult and was able to drive and go out by myself, I've been doing it a lot. So those are like my biggest hobbies. I play video games too, but
yeah, no worries about bleeds there. Hopefully,
right? Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's been almost a year, so like, have you seen it improving over time? Did it work kind of right away? Is it becoming any less effective? Like, what has the course been for you since you've had this treatment?
This is really cool. So when I first got the gene therapy, I was doing my weekly blood draws to see where my factor levels were. So I'm hemophilia B, moderate, bleed like severe, 2%. So 2% is my normal level without having my factor to get me to my half-life of about 15%. I think my second week, we started noticing that it was going up. It was very slow. But once I was getting, 4 or 5 months into it, my levels were actually up into the high 20s, and then it was to the 30s. But now, they're at 40%, and I go to sleep knowing that. So it's pretty nice. And they just keep going up too. They're not going down. They're not fluctuating a lot. It just keeps going up and up and up. So it's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Without
absolutely.
having to use. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. If I'm poking or prying too much, forgive me.
No, you're fine.
But I do want to ask because, like this being a functional cure, right? Like it doesn't actually change your DNA, so you could pass this on, like if you have children. Yeah. Is that something that you've been concerned about? Or do you feel like, with this being hopeful that you've had treatment that's been so effective that it may be less of a concern?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really concerned about it. Even if we didn't have the gene therapy, if it didn't exist by the time I had kids, let's just say hypothetically, I wouldn't be worried about it. I'm not doing a shout out, but everybody at the Hemophilia Outreach Center is absolutely wonderful. And they're always extremely supportive. So I would have no problems. with trusting them with, all of that if I had a question. But also, living with it too is another big thing. So if I were to pass it on and have a child and they have the bleeding disorder, I wouldn't be nervous about it. It's just like, oh, well, now I got to do what my dad did.
Yeah, I got this down, Pat.
Yeah.
The routine, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know for sure 100%, but I do know that you had to be 18 to do the gene therapy.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yep. You had to be 18 to do it.
At least for now.
Right, for now, exactly.
Right.
I don't know what it's going to look like. It could be completely different, even a year from now.
I know. Imagine being able to get it as a child.
Yeah.
And not only all of those years that you didn't have to get pricked by a needle, but all of those years that you could have been out playing football and not worrying about it. And Absolutely. There must have been there'd be a huge relief on the parents' shoulders too. So
yeah, for sure.
The implications of this is amazing. One thing that we did talk about is the concern that, gene therapies sometimes wear off. You might might develop antibodies to the vector. So, when or if that happens, do you have concern about that, about having to kind of go back to infusions?
No, it wouldn't really be a concern to have to do it. I wouldn't want to, and I'd be very sad if I had to, but it wouldn't be a concern. It would be a major letdown for sure.
And hopefully at that point they have another one anyways, and you'll just move on to the next one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But, like I said before, about having a child going to the hemo center, I mean, obviously I would be, in great hands going there. So it's not going to be, right. It wouldn't be the end of the world. It would still suck, but
it'd be a bummer. It'd be a big bummer.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Melody. And once again, that segment was brought to you by CSL Behring, which now has a first-of-its-kind hemophilia B treatment. Visit beyondhemb.com or download the B Support app wherever you get your apps for more information. All right, my blood brothers from across the pond, Laurence Woollard and Clive Smith, are back to tell us about what's going on with the UK blood inquiry. They join us now.
Listeners, I am here with friends of the podcast, Laurence Woollard and Clive Smith. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I feel lucky that I get to talk to you instead of Patrick.
I was hoping to ask Patrick if he'd had any more bath bleeds, so I'm disappointed. Lovely to see you, Amy, but
I know.
I think he's avoiding us.
I think so too. No. Never. We'll have to text him about bath bleeds because I don't know the answer to that either. But this conversation actually started a little bit, I think, from a conversation Patrick and I had a few podcasts ago about the tainted blood crisis in both of our countries. Y'all, of course, from the UK, and how we don't talk about this enough. And Clive, I just kind of wanted to throw it over to you to give listeners a bit of a synopsis of what this has been like in the UK. It's very different than what has happened over here in the States. And really, I'm playing a little bit of an ignorant card as well. I would love to know a little bit more about the history and where you guys are at. So I'll throw it over to you. Good, sir.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When you mentioned this in the podcast, it was something that really resonated with me. And Laurence and I talked about this recently, that I still remember going to WFH in 2018 in Glasgow. And I think I heard one person talk about HIV or hepatitis or a relative that had died. And that was one conversation over the course of many days. And I thought, we just don't talk about this enough in our community. And for so many people, I think particularly HIV, but hepatitis C too, that the stigma that still exists even today is absolutely huge. So thank you for having both of us on, because it's such a welcome opportunity to talk about this within our community and hopefully share some learnings for everybody too. And you're right in the sense that what happened in the US was different, but it's so similar too. There are differences and similarities. And I guess we have to rewind really to 2017 when the public inquiry, the infected blood inquiry here in the UK was announced. It was announced by the then Prime Minister Theresa May, and I think many people will wonder, well, why? Well, A, why did it take so long? And B, how did it finally come about all those years later? It was, as ever, it's a number of things. And I have to say, obviously, I speak as someone with severe haemophilia and as the chair of the Haemophilia Society here in the UK, but no one person was responsible for this. There are so many people who have campaigned and worked so hard over the years. I think it was JFK, wasn't it, who said that success has many parents whilst failure is an orphan. And that's so true of this, that we're here now because of so many people, and so many people who are sadly no longer with us as well. So in 2017, there were three really big things. Firstly, the political situation in the UK. The Prime Minister at the time, the party that was in government, needed the support of another small political party, and small but very significant political party in Northern Ireland. They entered into what was known as a confidence and supply arrangement. And one of their riders, apparently, to entering into power with them was that they wanted the Prime Minister to announce a public inquiry. There had also been a letter by all the leaders of all the major opposition parties, a joint letter saying, we all agree, we all support this, so we think you should do it. The second thing that happened at the time, there was a politician by the name of Andy Burnham who stepped down as a member of Parliament so he could run to be the mayor of Greater Manchester. You can't do both jobs at the same time. In Manchester, at least, you can in some other areas of the country. And he used what was known as his valedictory speech in Parliament. So the last speech he ever made in Parliament before stepping down, he used that to raise the scandal. And he talked about having evidence of a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. And he said to government, he said, if you don't launch a public inquiry, he said, I will go to the police with this evidence. So he was really trying to force the government's hand on that. The third thing that was happening was there was a group litigation order. Back in 1989, when people were infected, specifically with HIV, there was a court case against the government. The case settled out of court for many reasons, primarily because people were ill and dying and they were desperate for the money. And many people, everyone had to agree to settle and take an out of court payment. In addition to that, they also had to sign a waiver, what's been referred to now as the waiver, which meant that you couldn't take action against the government in relation to any other bloodborne viruses. And of course, this was at a time when we didn't know about hepatitis C. There was no test available for it. And some people have talked about this as one of the greatest strokes that government ever played on our community, was to do that, to say, right, we know you've got hepatitis C, we know you're probably going to want to sue us in the future, sign here so you can't do it. And so there was a legal case going on here in England, specifically England and Wales, in relation to challenging that waiver, whether that was lawful, to sign away your rights to something you never knew you had in the first place. So it was a coalescence, really, of those three things that came together, and eventually the Prime Minister announced this public inquiry. And it really was, it happened very quickly, and to the extent that she told her cabinet, she told all the other senior government ministers on the Tuesday morning, and it was announced at 1 o'clock on the 1 o'clock news here in the UK, and we as the Haemophilia Society found out about it at 12 o'clock. Quite often you'd have embargoed access, this kind of thing, for a week or so, or maybe a few days, so you can get your house in order and do things. That never happened. So this happened really quickly. The society and the first call for a public inquiry in 1989, and many other people have kept up the campaign too, other campaign groups too. So for it to happen almost overnight was just incredible. And we actually happened to have a board meeting on the Wednesday in London. And I remember catching the train from where I live in Yorkshire and getting the big local newspaper, the Yorkshire Post, and we were front page news. And it felt, it was so momentous to finally see that this was on the front page. It was grabbing the headlines. It was getting attention. It was the culmination of so much. But we knew that it was the end of the beginning, in the sense that we knew the next phase was coming in terms of the inquiry.
That is fascinating. And when was that? That
was 2017, July 2017.
2017.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Laurence, what were your memories of that time? In particular, like 2017, where were you? What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, so firstly, again, thank you for obviously having me and to join Clive here. And I think without embarrassing Clive, I think I want to acknowledge that his role as chair of the Haemophilia Society, but also the Haemophilia Society as an organisation, the leadership that they've given on this issue has been remarkable. And to Clive's point, there's a lot of individual campaigners and groups, that have worked tirelessly to get, the inquiry and what where we are today. So I want to acknowledge that, and also as somebody from a family that was affected, losing my grandparents as a consequence of contaminated blood. I think it's fascinating, as Clive points out, that policy window and how that opened up at the time because of those different streams that Clive's alluded to. I think, to be honest, just complete disbelief. My relationship with my mum was already very strong, but actually to kind of go on this journey with her, and particularly around writing the personal statement for the inquiry, over an 11,000 word statement, and really delving in and opening up with some of those scars. And it's been really painful process, but also a really sort of healing one at the same time, and actually truly understanding for my mum, what her parents, what my grandparents actually went through, and what they had suffered, and then obviously what we've heard, throughout the inquiry. It's been, it's been a real, it's been a real experience, to be honest. And obviously we're now looking, to the report being published in May.
Clive, for those of us Americans listening on the show, tell me a little bit about this process. What has it been like? What, has there been resistance to this inquiry? What has the past few years been like in terms of process?
I think Laurence made a really good point there in terms of everybody. The inquiry was the Holy Grail. And when we got it, everyone thought, well, that's it. Everything's going to be resolved. We're going to get this sorted now. But I remember speaking about this on the news quite early on when I was asked a similar question, what's it been like initially? And it's been relief that people have finally been able to talk about it. It's been vindication that actually so much of what people have been telling government and everyone else for years, they said this is true. There's a journalist here in the UK called Caroline Wheeler. She's the political editor of one of our major newspapers here, the Sunday Times. And she tells a story about being, a really junior reporter, being sat there on the news desk and somebody ringing her up. And she just thought this guy was a complete crackpot. And she went away and she, what we'd refer to in modern day parlance as fact checked everything he told her. And she said her jaw pretty much just dropped and said, I couldn't believe it. Everything he was telling me was true. And it was just the most bizarre, tall story I'd ever heard. And every single word of it was true. And so I think so many people have felt vindicated by the evidence that's come out. In terms of the process, it's taken longer than we anticipated, partly because of COVID. Obviously, that interrupts it in the middle. Partly, I think the inquiry took a little bit longer to get set up than might have normally happened, because there was another public inquiry here in the UK. There was a huge fire in West London called Grenfell where 71 people died. And that happened very shortly before. And so that inquiry being set up, I think, possibly caused a little bit of delay in the administration here. But once it got going, and Laurence and I were talking about this recently, that the chair of the inquiry is a gentleman by the name of Sir Brian Langstaff, who's a retired High Court judge. Him and his team, because he'd want us to acknowledge everybody, the humanity that they've shown the community has been it's been incredible, and it's been in contrast to the way that government's treated everyone for decades. It really has. And that's, I think, what's the most striking about it. And every day you'd go, people would get there early in the morning, they would have coffee and a biscuit. And I've said to Laurence, it's so much more than tea and biscuits or coffee and cake, whatever you want to call it. But it's because people have been there, and we have to acknowledge as well, this isn't just about haemophilia, because the inquiry's been about people who were infected here from whole blood transfusions too. Many women, sadly, were given blood during childbirth, for example. So many people have not spoken about it, and they've gone there, and for the first time they've been able to sit in a room and talk to somebody who knows their background and knows their story without them having to tell them. And that has been really, really powerful, just to have their voice heard and be acknowledged. And it's like you can see people walk out and their shoulders just look that bit lighter. And there've been lots of themes that have come out of this inquiry, and I'm sure these are where the similarities really come out in the US, in Canada, in Ireland. And I should say that people like David Page in Canada and Brian O'Mahony in Ireland have been fantastic confidants and support through all of this. I've always been able to pick up the phone to them or drop them an email or have a chat to them at a conference somewhere, and the benefit of their experience has been really huge for us. So I should acknowledge both of them in all of this as well. But the common themes, the testing for people with HIV without them knowing, and then finding out that they had HIV and not telling them, and then them going on to infect their partners and then their partners dying. The manner in which people's diagnosis was communicated, in a corridor or shouted across a car park, or the matter-of-fact way in which people were told you've got HIV and you've probably only got a couple of years to live, or people being told to terminate their pregnancies, that they shouldn't be having children, that stories of people having friends visit and then or going to visit people, and when they left they would then burn the bed sheets. Those kinds of things, that the stigma that's come out. And even during the occurrence of the inquiry, one person gave evidence and said that she had a tenancy cancelled on her flat because there was a legal letter that came through from her solicitors, from her lawyers, and it was about her father who died from contaminated blood, and her landlord just said, "I don't want you living in this property," and kicked her out. And this was within a handful of years ago, not even that. And so the stigma that's still here, because one of the things that happened here in the UK, there was a huge campaign, and viewers can go on YouTube, and if you put in AIDS Tombstone campaign, you can watch the advert. And it was chilling, the voice on it, the tombstones. It was a public health campaign fundamentally, and it was told, and the slogan was "Don't die of ignorance," and it was warning people about HIV, the fact if you caught it and you got AIDS, then you would die, all those sorts of things. And there was a leaflet delivered to every home in the country, in the UK. And that didn't even happen, I don't think, Laurence, during COVID, did it? I mean, there were leaflets and things, but in terms of a concerted campaign, that campaign back in the 80s, and the shadow that has cast over the community is so long. It really is. And now we're at a stage where, of course, treatment for HIV is so good that people are undetectable viral load. You can have children through unprotected sex, all those sorts of things. But the government have never done anything to rebalance that narrative that people know about. There's a TV program over here called EastEnders, which has done a fantastic job of doing that, actually, through one of its characters talking about his infection. And they were brilliant, actually. In the 80s, they had another character who was infected with HIV, and they were really, really good at communicating what it actually looked like in real life. So all those themes that we've had throughout, but I think we have been able to make some progress during the currency of the inquiry. So, as you know, with the United Kingdom, we are 4 countries effectively, and we have devolved governments. So this was actually the 3rd inquiry we've had here in the UK. So there was another inquiry in 2008. It was an independent inquiry. So it wasn't what we call a statutory inquiry. So it didn't have any power to compel witnesses to attend, to demand evidence be produced to, etc. So it worked on people's goodwill. And that was a helpful inquiry, but didn't really come out with any major conclusions or recommendations, and of course didn't have the force of a full statutory inquiry behind it. There was then another inquiry in Scotland, the Penrose inquiry, which happened after power was devolved to Scotland. Now, of course, lots of this happened when Westminster in London was at the heart of this, so it couldn't really compel the production of the really important documents. So that was helpful to an extent in Scotland, because they had then a full clinical review about support for people with HIV and hepatitis, and the support payments that were paid annually to people then got increased. But then what happened, when the inquiry first kicked off, one of the things that the chair heard loud and clear from everybody was the fact that depending which country you're infected, you're receiving different levels of support payments. It's like being in the US, and depending which state you're infected in, you would get more if you lived in one than you did in another. And everyone's saying, well, hang on, we're all the same. Why is this not equal? And he had this really powerful line. He talked about the grinding hardship that was causing to everybody. So many people who've given up their lives, women particularly, have given up their careers to look after their children, their loved ones, all those people, and have never had acknowledgement or recompense for that. So the day the inquiry first sat hearing evidence, we had a huge uplift in payments of, I think, something like £76 million. And the government announced it on the day, which was welcome and frustrating. Obviously, they did it to try and steal the headlines away from the bad news that was going to be coming their way on the day when people were giving evidence. But that was very helpful. And the other significant thing we managed to do is we managed to have a compensation study. And the chair of that study he made 19 recommendations. In fact, interim compensation has been paid to everyone who was infected of £100,000 already. But the chair of the current public inquiry, as Laurence alluded to, it's going to report in May of this year, on the 21st of May. He's recommended that the government get on with setting up a compensation body already. He said, people are still dying. People are still dying at the rate of 1 every 4 days here in the UK. We know that from figures. And he's saying, people don't have the luxury of time. They want to go to their graves knowing that their families will be looked after financially. And he told the government that they should get on and set up this scheme by the end of last year. And the government have still done nothing about it. And so a couple of weeks ago, we had a lobby in Parliament. In fact, 2 weeks tomorrow, we had a lobby in Parliament, meeting our members of Parliament, trying to raise this, get this up the agenda. We've also got an amendment in a bill before Parliament at the moment, something known as the Victims and Prisoners Bill. It's in front of the other house. So we have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So you have the Senate and the House of Representatives, and it's in front of the reviewing chamber, as it were, the House of Lords. And as soon as that becomes an act of Parliament, the clock starts ticking for government to do this. And it was really significant. So I was actually in London, and I was in Parliament on the Monday night back in December when they had the vote on this amendment. And the government lost by 4 votes. So it was a very narrow vote. But the 10 different parties voted for this amendment. So you can see how much cross-party support this has. And it was a huge historic moment, because it was the first time the government had lost a vote in Parliament since 2019. So, it was all over the newspapers the next day. It was a really big moment. So we keep going, we keep trying, we keep being frustrated in the delay. Like you, we're going to have an election this year. You've got your election in November, we've got an election, which means politically the dynamic is challenging, because we have to try and ride 2 horses in the same race, because the current government, and we suspect strongly that there will be a change of government at some point this year. So that really spreads us a little bit more thinly than we like to be as well.
Yeah.
Clive and Laurence, the next question is out of sheer ignorance, but explain a little bit the difference between the States and the UK in terms of manufacturers' responsibility in the blood contamination crisis, and I think the communication, obviously, failures that happened. You are focused on the government, and tell me a little bit about the differences there.
Laurence, do you want to answer that, or shall I give it a go?
Yeah, Clive. I think Clive, obviously.
I'm just thinking everyone's bored of hearing my voice at this stage. So.
I honestly could listen to Clive on this subject. He's so eloquent and heartfelt about this subject for hours. I think, if I may, before Clive answers that, if I may, Amy, there's just a few points, and then I'll let Clive riff, because I think your question's vitally important. I was just going to say, one, that to Clive's point, the dignity and respect shown by the inquiry team has been remarkable. I think, 2, the generational impact of this scandal, and I think being at the inquiry and seeing the ages of different people and their families, I think really hits home. I think 3, something Clive mentioned again, which is about this idea that what happened was quote unquote bad luck, and how that had been socialised within Westminster and within different governments over the decades. I find that, I think it's how that happened, how that actually occurred. I think is something we'll look back on, as a learning, one of the many learnings from this inquiry. I also just wanted to mention that I think, again, as a family, we were really privileged to be able to hear evidence from my grandfather's physician, because he was still alive. And actually, he treated my 2 older brothers and I as well during our paediatric care. And so I think, for many people, because of 30, 40 years being too late. For them, they weren't actually able to hear, I think the saying is from the horse's mouth, from those physicians that had treated their family members or themselves, if obviously they've survived. So I think for us, again, there was a level of privilege there, understanding, what it may have been like for my granddad, and obviously for my grandmother. And also just to say, I think that even kind of sort of post actually, what was going on with treatment at the time. And I think Clive had mentioned about the waiver that the likes of my nan was forced to sign in the early 90s, the schemes that were set up to provide some financial assistance for those infected and their partners on the scheme. The government and those arm's length organisations, they had a duty of care to look after the most vulnerable, and they completely failed to do that. And the likes of my nan didn't have that level of provision, whereby she was obviously living with, the health consequences of being an infected partner, given that my grandfather sadly died in 1987, but my grandmother survived till 2003, that, she had to, she was still having to part-time work even to her sort of pension age. She died at 73. She was having to let out a room to have a lodger just to be able to kind of pay for living. All of those things, as with many that have been impacted by this scandal, they didn't deserve that, and they didn't deserve the treatment post, the actual sort of the time of what was going on with the actual product use. So I think, so thanks for letting me share those. And I think, I'll pass over to Clive, to maybe just explore a little bit more in detail, as you said, around what was known or not known, I guess, at the time in terms of what was happening with product.
Yeah, I think we can largely split it to England and Wales and then Scotland and Northern Ireland. So I think that the majority of infection that took place in England and Wales, not all, but the majority, was as a result of imported product. And sadly, of course, that was imported from the US. When it came to Scotland, though, they've always had a very strong medical profession and tradition there. They've had what we call royal colleges there who issue guidance and support for healthcare professionals. And so they always had their own sort of fractionation centres. And so nearly all of their infection was kind of homegrown, as it were, from domestic donors. And of course, there's a difference, isn't it? And some of that was then used in Northern Ireland too. But of course, the huge difference between the US and the UK, of course, is the altruistic system we have for blood donations here rather than payments. Payments for blood has never been allowed here for many, many years. And I think that fundamentally changed the landscape. And I think to Lawrence's point, the infections and the viruses were one thing, but when you sit there and listen to the evidence day after day after day, you just feel that every level of protection that was there to protect patients failed. The layers of failure, the sourcing blood from people on Skid Row, prostitutes, drug addicts, prisoners, etc., and then pooling it, and then prescribing it, and then failing to respond to people's infections, and then causing them to fight and campaign for 40 years to get a public inquiry. In all of this, you just think, where is the humanity in any of this? I think we as the society describe this in our opening as a humanitarian disaster which required a humanitarian response. And you've just never seen that. You really haven't. And to Lawrence's point, Lawrence used the phrase, he talked about incredibly bad luck. And Lawrence is using that because one of the former prime ministers here in the UK, Sir John Major, when he gave evidence, some people might not like me saying this, but I actually thought, generally speaking, I thought he was a very good witness. And I thought he didn't really put a foot wrong. But one comment he made, I think towards the end of the morning in his evidence, was he talked about the fact that people with haemophilia being infected with these viruses was incredibly bad luck. And I think if you take a step back, I think I can appreciate what he was trying to say, but he said it in an incredibly ham-fisted way, in the sense that, you know, people with diabetes or epilepsy were never going to be at risk of infection through HIV and hepatitis. It was always going to be people with haemophilia who were at risk because of blood products as a result of these viruses. So when he described it as being incredibly bad luck, I mean, there were audible gasps in the room. I was there when he gave evidence. Everyone just went, oh, sorry, what? And he tried to correct it later on in his evidence, and sadly, I think probably compounded it. And there are many people who would probably spit if they ever heard his name mentioned. So that was really hard. You know, you imagine being an American and a former president stands in a room and says, what happened to you was just incredibly bad luck. Everyone's sitting there going, no, it damn well wasn't. No, it really wasn't.
That's incredible. You mentioned that there will be a report coming out in May. Yeah. What are the next steps? What's the future look like? Again, for us ignorant Americans that don't understand.
Not at all. And this is something that I've been aware of for some time. So one of the really big takeaways that I got from David and Brian when speaking to them about their inquiries is they always said to us, look, there are two phases to this. First of all, you need a good inquiry. Secondly, you need a good government response. And so, you know, we're coming to the end of the inquiry, and I hope more than half of the work has been done, but I don't think more than half of the job, has been done, because the job now is to get a good response from government, obviously financially in terms of compensation, but there are so many other things as well. You know, some people would like a memorial, some people, so we had last year for the first time, we had a doctor appointed as what's known as a patient safety commissioner here in England, as a result of another scandal in relation to other products that are used in healthcare here. And we all feel that if we had our inquiry 20 years ago, we might have had a patient safety commissioner and people might have been prevented from harm. And, you know, in all scandals, whatever goes wrong, you know, be it 9/11, be it this, be it many other disasters around the world, everybody's united, I think, by the one desire that they never want it to happen to anybody again. You know, even your worst enemy, you wouldn't wish this on, because it was so traumatic and so horrific. And so I think it's about learning lessons. I think it's about changing culture within the healthcare system too. And I think that's a really important piece to talk about right now, particularly with things like gene therapy, you know, things like informed consent. And I talk about informed consent at the moment, particularly around gene therapy, that it's not a static decision, that people need to know about other treatments coming down the line. They need to know about other options. Is this right? This might be right for me today, but is it right for me tomorrow? And so that relationship, I think, with healthcare professionals, that paternalistic attitude has got to change. And I think we have more of a challenge here in the UK. I think this is a difference actually between the US and the UK, because in the US, you obviously sadly have to pay for your healthcare. And I always describe it as like going into a restaurant. If you go into a restaurant and have bad service, you complain or you don't go back. You might do both. In the UK, because it's funded through taxes, everybody's just really grateful for whatever they get. And not only that, but it's a challenge having a lifelong condition. You don't want to upset your nurse. You don't want to upset your doctor or the receptionist or whoever else it is, because you've got to go back and see them again, potentially. Sometimes it will get to a situation where your relationship just breaks down so much, you might end up moving to another doctor or to another centre, whatever it is. But I think that's a real challenge within the UK health system and within haemophilia and other bleeding disorders where you've got a lifelong condition. I think we're more reluctant to challenge at times and push back and ask questions for fear of rocking the boat. And I think that's something we need to talk about a little bit more at times.
And just that inertia, isn't it, that you're speaking to, Clive? But also I think as well, Amy, whilst it's kind of very obviously kind of a reflective practice, the inquiry, I guess there's also this kind of forward-looking element about actually, you know, in terms of kind of redressing those historical wrongdoings, not only on sort of an individual and family level, but actually at a system level about, you know, investment into inherited bleeding disorders care. You know, we know that there are, you know, as much as the US, we know that there's disparities in clinical provision across the UK. And I think, again, it's about sort of equity and about, you know, how do we ensure that, you know, everybody has equity of access to the relevant services to live as fulfilling a life as possible? And I think, you know, I don't know whether Clive wants to comment and if we have time, but I know that there's a national psychological service that's, I think, potential being implemented. But,
Yeah, I mean, we carried out that peer review, didn't we, in the UK, launched back in 2019, that showed that 2/3 of centres in the UK have inadequate physio and 2/3 of centres have inadequate psychological support. And, at a time when the community is going through an infected blood inquiry, a public inquiry, to not have sufficient psychological support is appalling. The situation's been slightly better in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, but the government are only now really implementing a proper psychological support service for those infected and affected by contaminated blood, because it's really important that we don't forget about the families who are left behind, who don't have a connection with a haemophilia centre. So those with haemophilia can walk into a centre and hopefully get some support. But for those who lost their loved ones and don't have any connection with their centres anymore, and some of them don't want to go into the centres. I spoke to a doctor recently, I won't say who it was, but they said to me, we sometimes think of the hospital as just a building. And she said it's not. She said it's so much more. And for people who were infected in these places, to have to keep coming back and be reminded of that is really harrowing. And so there's a danger that people don't go and get the psychological support. They don't go and get the physical support they need. If they're having a bleed or a problem, they don't want to go and see the physio, because actually just going to that place is really triggering and traumatic for them. And this goes to the generational harm piece that Laurence talks about, which, whilst this happened in the 70s and 80s, I've said already, it's cast a really long shadow over our community, which is why, coming back to where we started, it's great that we're talking about this a little bit more, because that can only help everybody, I think.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much to the both of you for coming on and sharing. I really appreciate it, and we'll have you on more. I'd love to have you back on when the report is published and kind of get your thoughts on the government's reaction and all the things. But hear, and hats off to both of you for the work that you've done, and to your communities for coming out and sharing their stories. That is a very courageous thing to do and an important thing to do, and we're all moved by it over here.
Thank you, Clive, Laurence, Mason, and Melody. And thank you to all who helped put together this episode of the Bloodstream Podcast, which of course would not be possible without our presenting sponsor, Takeda. Visit bleedingdisorders.com for more, and thanks as well to CSL Behring for their support of the gene therapy segment. Visit beyondhemb.com for more. Bloodstream is back, Amy Board, on May 24th. What can the audience expect to hear then?
We have an interview with Shelley Horowitz, who was formerly with HFA, but the work that she does at HFA, or did rather at HFA, is really important about mild hemophilia. They actually have a phenomenal, very clinical and research-based program for folks, men and women, that have mild hemophilia. So hear more about mild matters on the next episode of Bloodstream.
And with that, that is all for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Bloodstream Podcast wherever you listen to have the next episode delivered to you the moment it goes live.
And loyal listeners, as always, mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com is that email address you can use to inquire about our casting opportunities. You can find us on social media and all the things Bloodstream Media on social media to contact us too. We're there. It's going to be great.
You'll find us, and we're quite excited about it. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm your other host, Amy Board.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.